Welcome back to Rooted in Reason, where faith meets thoughtful inquiry. We're diving back into this huge question. Can evil and suffering really cancel out God? Last time we looked at some of the logical arguments against God because there's evil and suffering.
Yeah. Let's face it, even if you can prove on paper that God could exist alongside all the bad stuff, that doesn't always make the pain go away. No. It's way easier to talk about suffering in theory than it is to actually live through it.
So true.
It's like you can say God has a plan all you want, but when you're the one going through something tough, it's just hard to wrap your head around that.
Yeah, for sure.
So how do we even begin to reconcile the reality of suffering with the idea of a loving God? Where do we even start?
Right. I mean, that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest roadblocks we face is our limited perspective. We're stuck in this tiny bubble of time and space, and we only see a tiny fraction of the bigger picture. It's like trying to understand a whole movie by watching just one scene.
Yeah.
Out of context.
Exactly. Like if you just walked into a movie in the middle, you'd be totally lost.
Totally.
You wouldn't know the characters, the plot, the context.
Right.
You'd just see a bunch of random stuff happening.
Yeah, you'd be like, what is going on?
And it's kind of how it is with suffering. We're seeing these isolated events, these painful moments without understanding how they fit into the larger story. Like we're missing the beginning, the middle, and the end.
Yeah, and to make things even more complicated, we're also limited by our own intellect and insight, right? I mean, we just don't have the capacity to grasp the full complexity of God's plan or the reasons behind everything that happens.
It's like trying to explain calculus to a toddler.
Right.
Like their brains just aren't developed enough to understand it.
Right.
And in the same way, our human minds can only comprehend so much.
Right.
We can't expect to fully understand the infinite wisdom and power of God.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people, especially teens, struggle with the idea that God could have any good reason for allowing certain kinds of suffering. Like I get that we don't see the whole picture, but some things just seem so senseless, so cruel. How can a loving God allow that?
Yeah, and that's a valid question. But sometimes the problem isn't that God doesn't have a good reason. It's that we're looking at the situation with incomplete information. It's all about perspective.
Yeah.
Think of it like this. Imagine you see a guy who weighs, 400 pounds.
Okay.
Just based on that, you might assume he's not very athletic.
Yeah, but I probably wouldn't picture him running a marathon or anything.
Right, but what if you found out that this guy is a professional sumo wrestler?
Yeah.
Suddenly your whole perspective shifts.
Yeah.
You realize that his weight is actually an asset in his sport. You see his strength, his agility, his skill,
Right.
Things you wouldn't have noticed before.
Wow, that's a really good analogy. So you're saying that suffering alone might make God seem distant or uncaring. But if we consider other evidence for his existence, his love, his power, the whole picture might start to look different.
Exactly. It's like judging a book by its cover. If we only focus on the negative, on the pain and suffering, we're missing out on the bigger story, the reasons why God might allow those things to happen.
Okay.
And Christianity in particular offers some key insights that can help us make sense of suffering in a whole new light.
Okay, I'm all ears. What are some of those insights?
Well, for starters, Christianity challenges the idea that the main goal in life is to be happy.
Okay.
We live in a culture that's obsessed with happiness, with avoiding pain at all costs.
Yeah.
But Christianity suggests that there's something more important, something more fulfilling than just feeling good all the time.
So you're saying it's not all about rainbows and butterflies.
Exactly.
There's more to life than just being happy.
Exactly. Christianity teaches that the ultimate purpose of life is to know God, to have a relationship with him. And this relationship is what brings true and lasting joy, even in the midst of suffering.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
But honestly, that's a tough sell, especially for teens. Like when you're going through a breakup or you bomb a test or your family's going through a rough patch, it's hard to see how knowing God is going to make things better.
Oh, I hear ya. I've been there. But think about it this way. When you have a close friend, someone you trust and rely on, don't they help you through tough times?
For sure.
Don't they make the pain a little easier to bear?
Yeah, totally. Like when I'm struggling with something, talking to my best friend always helps. It doesn't magically make the problem disappear, but it makes me feel less alone. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's what God offers us, a deep, abiding friendship that sustains us through thick and thin. He's not some distant being who's oblivious to our pain. He's right there with us, walking alongside us through the fire.
That's actually really comforting. It's like even when things are falling apart, we have someone who gets it, someone who cares, someone who's stronger than our struggles.
Yep.
But even with that, don't we still have to wrestle with the question of why bad things happen in the first place? Like, if God is all-powerful and all-loving, why is there so much pain and suffering in the world?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And to really understand it, we need to dive into some of the core beliefs of Christianity. It's not just about warm, fuzzy feelings. It's about a worldview that helps us make sense of the world, even the messy parts.
Okay, I'm ready to dive in. Let's unpack some of these core beliefs and see how they shed light on the problem of suffering.
Okay. So one of the core beliefs that shapes how Christians view suffering is this idea that humanity is in the state of rebellion against God. It's like we've chosen to go our own way, ignoring his guidance and pursuing things that ultimately lead to pain and brokenness.
Okay, so it's like we've kind of messed things up.
Oh,
Like we've strayed from the path and gotten ourselves lost in the woods.
that's a great way to put it. And when we look at the world around us, we see the consequences of that rebellion everywhere. We see selfishness, greed, hatred, violence, all these things that cause suffering for ourselves and others.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like when you think about all the wars, the crime, the poverty, the injustice, it's not hard to see that something's gone wrong. But if God is so powerful, why doesn't he just fix it? Why doesn't he stop people from doing bad things?
That brings us to another important concept, free will. Christianity teaches that God created us with the ability to choose to make our own decisions, even if those decisions aren't always the best.
So it's like God gave us this amazing gift of freedom, but we kind of abused it. Like we took a wrong turn and ended up in a ditch.
Exactly. And while it might seem like God could just force us to be good, that would actually undermine the whole idea of love. Think about it. If you had a friend who only hung out with you because you made them, would that really be a true friendship?
No way. That would be
Yeah.
super creepy. Like a robot friend or something. A real friend chooses to be with you because they genuinely care about you.
Right. And God wants that same kind of genuine relationship with us, one that's based on love and trust, not coercion or manipulation. So he gives us the freedom to choose, him to choose love, to choose the path that leads to life, but he also allows us to choose the opposite, to choose selfishness, to choose rebellion, to choose the path that leads to pain and destruction.
Okay, I get that.
Yeah.
But it's still hard to wrap my head around the idea that God would allow people to make choices that hurt themselves and others. Like, wouldn't a loving God want to protect us from pain, from making those wrong turns?
He does, but he also knows that true growth, true transformation comes from making those choices, from experiencing the consequences of our actions, and ultimately from learning from our mistakes.
So it's like those times when your parents let you make your own decisions, even though they know you might mess up.
Yeah.
They're not being mean. They're actually helping you learn and grow.
Exactly. They're giving you the space to become your own person, to develop your own character. And in the same way, God allows us to experience the consequences of our choices, not because he's indifferent to our pain, but because he knows it's ultimately for our good.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But what about those situations where people suffer through no fault of their own? Like what about natural disasters or accidents or illnesses? It's hard to see how those things could be part of some grand plan for good.
That's a really tough one. And honestly, there are no easy answers. But one thing that gives me comfort is the idea that God isn't limited by time the way we are. He sees the whole tapestry of our lives, the beginning, the middle, the end, and he knows how all the threads, even the dark and tangled ones, come together to create a beautiful design.
So it's like those optical illusions where you see a bunch of random dots, but when you step back, you realize it's actually a picture.
That's a great analogy. We might only see a small fragment of the picture, but God sees the whole thing. And he knows that even the most painful experiences can ultimately serve a purpose, even if we don't understand it in the moment.
Okay, I'm starting to see things a little differently. But what about all the people who are hurting right now? What about those who are facing unimaginable pain and suffering? What comfort or guidance does Christianity offer them?
Well, one of the most powerful truths in the Bible is that God is not distant or indifferent to our suffering. He's not some aloof being who's watching from afar. He actually enters into our pain with us.
He actually feels our pain. Like he's not just observing it, he's experiencing it with us.
Exactly. And this is where the story of Jesus becomes so important.
Okay, hold on. We haven't really talked about Jesus yet. How does he fit into all of this?
Well, Christians believe that Jesus is the Son of God who came to earth to experience the full spectrum of human suffering, physical pain, emotional anguish, spiritual darkness, even death itself.
Wait, so God actually experienced suffering firsthand? Like he didn't just send someone else to do it for him, he actually went through it himself.
Exactly. And that changes everything. It means that God understands our pain in a way that no one else ever could. He's not just sympathizing with us, he's empathizing with us. He's been there. He gets it.
Wow, that's really powerful. So even though we might not understand why we suffer, we can at least know that God understands what we're going through.
Absolutely. And he doesn't just understand it. He offers us a way through it. He offers us hope, healing, and the promise of a future where suffering will be no more.
Okay, that's a really encouraging thought. But what about those who are struggling to believe? Those who are wrestling with doubt and anger, what would you say to them?
I would say that it's okay to question, to doubt, even to be angry with God. He can handle it. He's big enough to hold all of our emotions, even the messy ones.
So it's not like we have to pretend everything's okay or put on a happy face for God.
Not at all. He wants us to come to him just as we are with all our brokenness and confusion. In fact, those raw, honest conversations are often the starting point for real healing and transformation.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, from the problem of human rebellion to the power of free will to the incredible love demonstrated through Jesus' sacrifice.
Yeah.
But where do we go from here? What does all this mean for us in our everyday lives?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's one that each of us has to grapple with individually. But here's what I know. God knows your name. He knows who you are, what you're going through, and he cares. And he promises to be with you every step of the way.
He promises to be with us through our suffering, even when it feels like he's a million miles away.
Especially then. Remember, God isn't afraid of our pain. He enters into it with us. And he can give us the strength to endure.
So, as we're wrapping up this whole deep dive into this question of whether evil and suffering cancel out God, it's important to remember that we've been in our heads a lot. Right?
Yeah, a lot of intellectual heavy lifting.
Yeah, exactly. We've been talking about these big concepts like free will and God's perspective.
Right.
But, sometimes when you're in the middle of something really tough, all that intellectual stuff can feel kind of distant and abstract.
It's like your head might get it,
Mm-hmm.
but your heart's still hurting.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it's like you might know in your head that God has a plan, but that doesn't magically make the pain disappear.
Exactly. And in those moments, it's okay to just sit with the pain.
Yeah.
To acknowledge it, to grieve. You don't have to force yourself to feel positive or have all the answers.
Right. It's like you don't have to put on a brave face for God.
Nope.
You can be real with him. You
Yeah.
can tell him how you're feeling, even if it's messy and raw and, kind of all over the place.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as you're processing those emotions, it's so important to remember that you're not alone. God is with you in your suffering, even when it feels like he's a million miles away.
It's like that verse in Psalm 23 that says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me."
Yeah, that's a great one. And one of the most comforting things I think about Christianity is that Jesus himself suffered.
Right.
He knows what it's like to experience pain, betrayal, loneliness, and even death.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about that.
Yeah.
Like the Son of God, the creator of the universe, actually chose to experience human suffering.
It's the ultimate act of love, and
Yeah.
it shows us that God understands our pain in a way that no one else ever could. He's not some distant deity who can't relate to our struggles. He's been there.
Right.
He gets it.
And because he's been there, he can offer us hope, healing, and the promise of a future where suffering will be no more.
Yeah, remember that passage we talked about earlier from Revelation chapter 21, verse 4? It talks about a time when God will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.
That's such a beautiful and powerful picture. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there's this glimmer of hope, this promise of something better to come.
Exactly. And, as we wrap up this conversation, I just want to encourage our listeners to keep seeking truth, keep asking questions, and keep drawing close to God.
Yeah, even when it's hard, even when you doubt, even when you're angry, God can handle it all.
He wants us to come to him just as we are, with all our brokenness and messiness.
This has been such an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, remember that you are loved, you're valued, and you are not alone. God is with you every step of the way. Thanks for joining us on Rooted and Reasoned. We hope this deep dive has helped you grapple with these tough questions about evil and suffering. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our podcast for more explorations of faith and reason. Until next time, keep seeking truth and keep the conversation going.